My name is Paul Gerbal. I'm the Director of Knowledge with Sport for Life Society and also a RBC Learn to Play mentor. And I've been working with the RBC Learn to Play project and project communities now for several years, as well as offering this webinar for several years in different forms and shapes. Provided it on our Sport for Life Leaders School. I've done it as a live webinar, and I've done it in several different formats. So again, as I said to Tyler just before we kicked off, I'm not exactly sure how long it's going to take today, but one thing I can promise you is we'll go over time. So if it ends a couple minutes short, then we'll just have some extra time to talk. As Tyler said, there is the opportunity to put your questions in the question pane as we go, and we'll be looking for those if any arise. We'll also have a couple of little interactive opportunities as we go, and maybe an opportunity for some live questions and discussion at the end. So this is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to look at a couple of different views and models of change and how change works in organizations. And we're going to look at trying to develop an effective approach to supporting change in the organizations or the communities that we're working with. Ideally, you'll generate some frameworking ideas for your change project as you go. Now, before I get into the question about how you feel about change, I just want to point out that in a way it doesn't matter too much because we're all in the change business whether we like it or not. I think all of the RBC Learn to Play projects are all about changing some aspect of a community, an organization, maybe collectively the whole country around principles of quality sport, physical literacy, and physical activity. So that's what we set out to do. And in fact, that's what just about all organizations set out to do just about every day. Every organization that has a plan, a strategic plan, well, it's about making some changes. Nobody would invest the time and effort in doing that kind of planning if they didn't need some changes. This is something that everybody wrestles with every day. And that's why I thought I'd start with this question about how do you feel about change? Because so often people hear that, people don't like change, they resist change. But let's just kind of think about that a little bit. Most people feel that this is a highly positive change in their lives. It certainly was in mine. And not that this is, my wife or little girl, but having a baby is the kind of change that many people look forward to, changes their lives in so many positive ways. So I've seldom heard it said that people resist having, their first or second child. This kind of change happens as well. So slow that sometimes we don't even realize it's happening around us. This kind of slow evolutionary change is invisible to us, and yet it's going on all the time in ways that we probably don't understand all the time. Then there's this kind of change, a little bit more familiar, a few years old, and now we can look at this slide with a little touch of something, irony, reminiscence. But if you remember the election of Obama in his first term, there was a tremendous tidal wave in the States of wanting a different kind of government. And in fact, the current administration with Trump, very much again, a tidal wave of wanting a different kind of government. And then there's this kind of change. Again, so many examples, but the kind of change that we see around us is not necessarily this kind of extremely difficult, in this case violent, kind of change. As I pointed out, there's many positive kinds of change that people strive for, work for, and invisible change that we don't even understand is going on all around us all the time. Now, again, this is a slide from a few years ago. Long-term athlete development, framework for quality sport, as it got going and started to impact sport across Canada, started to attract some very, very different perspectives. Here is one perspective that we saw quite a bit. criticism that it was an attempt to wipe competition out of sport, to change sport into something unrecognizable, to take out the fun of sport. And, you know, this article in the National Post, I think at one point referred to Ottawa bureaucrats or something like that as being behind this, you know, insidious, let's wipe sport out and remake it in some kind of strange mold kind of approach. But at the same time, we were seeing articles like this. People who were starting to take part in physical literacy based activities, people who were starting to try different ways of delivering sport, people who were trying to, I would say, encourage people to participate in multiple different kinds of sport participation. And it got tremendous positive press. And of course, positive response from people who actually tried it and enjoyed it. So, as always, we see these different perspectives. Some people for, some people against, some people perhaps not understanding, but all things that we in the change business have to find ways to work with. So when we hear that people resist change, it's good to stop and think about how many times we adopt something new, how many times we embrace change. And probably everybody on the webinar recognizes at least one of these kinds of phones. Unfortunately, I recognize all four of them and probably several kinds that came before them. But this is something that we've all experienced in our lives in the last, couple of decades, this rapid technological change that's really changed the way we do so many things in our lives. So now with the smartphone that almost all of us have, probably in our hands, texting now as I speak, we can do literally dozens of things that we couldn't do just a few years ago. And that's why when a new smartphone comes out, people are sometimes lined up around the block to get it, because they want to take part in this kind of change. They want to have this kind of ability. So I think it's good to stop as we kind of consider our projects in our communities and ask, what could we do? Could it be possible to support change, lead change in a way that would make people as excited as the latest smartphone or the latest piece of technology? Wouldn't it be great if people in your community were kind of lined up down the street to take part in the kind of physical activity, physical literacy, supportive activity, quality sport, depending on your project? Wouldn't that be something if people were as excited as they get about some of these technological changes that we see? And it helps to remember that for everyone, including ourselves as leaders in this process, change is a journey. It's a process. It's something that takes place over time, and everyone involved in it changes in some ways. We want to get from A to B. We tend to fixate on B because getting there has some value to us. Imagine if everybody in our sport club, for example, took part in sport in this better way. Imagine if everyone in our community center took part in more physical activity in ways that developed their all-around physical literacy. We want to get there. And when we think about getting there, we tend to fixate on these really nuts and bolts kinds of questions, like how long is it going to take us to get there? How fast can we do this? What's it going to cost? How hard will it be to get there? But it pays, as we start out thinking about this process and our role in it, to remember the value that's in the journey itself. We can learn a lot at each step of the way, and in fact, the process may work more effectively if we're attentive and take the time to learn and pay attention to what's going on at each step in the process. So as I speak and as we go for the next couple of minutes in this webinar, think I ask you to, if you can, think about what did you learn in the steps you've taken so far? What have you learned from the process as it's unfolded for you? What could we learn as we take the next steps to try to advance our projects? Think about not just getting to be, but about the value of learning as we travel the journey. So I'm going to show you a bunch of different perspectives on change, different frameworks, if you want to think of them that way. This one is from a writer named Cotter, who, as you can see at the bottom, 1996, I think this was in Harvard Business Review. He wrote a lot about change, and he came up with this 8-stage process for creating major change. So you can see the 8 steps there. And you know, I'm kind of curious if you've seen this before, if you've heard of Cotter's 8-stage process of change. I'd like to know whether this is familiar to you, but it's pretty common stuff, and a lot of people have seen it. So establish a sense of urgency, you know, create the guiding coalition, develop a vision, communicate the vision, enable action. Obviously there's, you know, he wrote articles and books that go with this that explain what enable action means in real life. But here are the, you know, the key points. Enable action. Create short-term wins, consolidate gains, produce more change, and then anchor new approaches in the culture. Again, they sound easy. Anchor new approaches in the culture maybe takes, you know, 3 seconds to say it, a little bit more effort to do it. But there's an approach to leading or guiding or supporting a change project. And you can think for a second, in my project, what would happen if I did these things? Did I do these things? You know, did we establish a sense of urgency right at the beginning? Did we communicate the change vision clearly to everybody? Did we have some short-term wins that we could consolidate and leverage so that we could produce more change? Maybe yes, maybe no. But we've got a little poll, because just thinking about, you know, Cotter's questions and the stages that he's got there, the 8 stages, I want to know if you can say, who do you think he's speaking to? So this is a little poll. You can just pick who you think he's talking to here, right? Is he talking to customers and clients? Is he talking to managers? Is he talking to facilitators? So I'm watching the poll results here as they kind of shift. It's like election night. They keep shifting back and forth. At some point they'll stabilize. About 60% of people have voted at this point. Slowing down at 63%. I'm presuming there's another 37% who are texting on their smartphones. All right, let's go with it. So here are the results that I see right now. There might still be another little shift or two, but 51% right now said they think he's speaking to facilitators. 40% think he's speaking to managers. And about 9% think speaking to customers or clients. So in my view, you know, I think he's speaking to managers, or at least leaders who are in some sort of power position in their organization. Because the phrasing of the 8 steps, this idea that you're going to, you know, create a sense of urgency, create a guiding coalition, that you're going to, you know, disseminate, communicate the change vision. These are things that people who either have some power or think they have some power are able to do. It's certainly not the perspective of the user, the customer, the client. It's not the perspective of the person that change is happening to. It's the perspective of somebody who is in a position to make change happen. And I think that's kind of interesting as we go forward and think about, you know, what that means for us. So the next poll question is, oh, there's the results. Okay, that's super. Final tally is in, 50% facilitators, 8% customers, clients. The next question, let me ask you the next question. Think about your project. What are you in your project? Are you a manager? Somebody who is in that position of power to make things happen, make change happen, get people to do what you want them to do? Are you a facilitator? Somebody who's just trying to lead a process, but not necessarily the person who has control or is able to direct the process? Or are you a participant in change? Is the change kind of happening to you or happening to you too? Because you can pick manager, facilitator, both. So again, people are voting. More people are voting quicker. Not sure if that means people got the hang of it or something good happened, but we're up to almost 80% now who have voted. And I think it's kind of topping out a little bit, so maybe we can just see the results on the screen like we did last time. There we go. So again, very few of you, only 8%, say that in your project you're a manager. You're the person who has more control or is able to direct the process. Much more of you said you're either a combination of things or you are a facilitator. So again, perspective is important, right? How we approach this process of leading change in our organizations is very, very strongly connected to the role that we're playing. And I think that's a reality that we need to kind of think about as we go. Now here's another model, another framework. The last one was Kotter's, this one is Rogers. And this model is called the Fusion of Innovation model, but that's not that important. What's important is that it's a stage-based model. It has 5 steps, right? It's a process, it's a journey. It's more of a journey maybe than Kotter's 8 steps look like. It suggests that people work through a process, and they have to work through a process in order to innovate, do something new, basically change. And here are the 5 steps. You can see them up on the screen, right? Knowledge, persuasion, decision, implementation, and confirmation. It's a pretty well-known model as well, just like Kotter's was. So I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of you have seen this or something like it as well. Now, one of the features of this model is the awareness that people adopt at different times. So this is a kind of a standard bell curve, and based on a lot of research, not just by Rogers but by others who investigated this model, they found that there's a very, very small percentage of people who are innovators, who are the first ones to invent and try new things. There's a significant but not very big group of early adopters. And then, of course, you get the early majority, the late majority, and then you get some people that just lag, just wait. They don't want to do it. They don't have the ability to do it. There's some reason why they don't implement change. They're the laggards. They're going to be last. But knowing this is actually quite useful and powerful. Now, I don't know if anybody's seen an online video about the shirtless dancing guy. If you have, hopefully you're smiling and chuckling. If I had more confidence in the webinar setup here, I'd try to show it, but I know that when I've done that in the past, I haven't got audio sometimes, or not everyone's been able to hear it. It hasn't gone well. So I'll just, if you haven't seen it, I'm going to describe it to you because it really is great. And after the webinar, I hope you'll Google shirtless dancing guy and watch the video. But basically, it's a video of a shirtless dancing guy on a hillside at looks like a concert, an outdoor concert, and he's dancing. And there's people sitting on the hill, and they're kind of looking at him like he's crazy. And the way he dances, he may be. But he's dancing, and nothing happens for about a couple of minutes in the video. There's a voiceover, he's dancing, and eventually somebody else gets up and starts dancing with him. And now there's two guys dancing. And they're having a riot. They're going nuts. And again, it takes a little bit of time. Nothing happens. Two guys dancing. And then all of a sudden, there's 10 people dancing. And once there's 10 people dancing, there's 50 people dancing, and the whole hillside is dancing. And you can see what is called the tipping point. So you see the shirtless dancing guy. He's out there for what seems like forever. You know, if it was me doing it, I'd feel like it was forever. You get the first follower who comes along after a couple minutes, and then it's just the two of them. And as the voiceover in the video says, it's the first follower that's so critical, because that's what turns one crazy nut into a movement. All of a sudden, there's somebody else doing it. And when there's somebody else doing it, other people want to try it, and you quickly get to this tipping point. And so that suggests a strategy. And the strategy that it suggests is try to reach the tipping point by focusing on the people who are likely to be early adopters and who will publicly and visibly endorse, take part in, adopt whatever it is you're trying to change. And you can see the same thing if we just kind of take that curve and kind of flip it around sideways. You know, there's your innovators, there's your early adopters, and you can see in the rate at which people adopt where the tipping point is. All of a sudden, the curve gets really, really steep. Just before the early majority, I'll get up and go, yeah, I want to do that. I want to dance with the crazy guy. So one lesson is to strategize around that, but another lesson is it takes a long time at the beginning before anything seems to happen. And that's a theme that I'll talk about several times as we go. So here comes another poll. Tyler can put that poll up. Now, if Kotter was speaking to managers, Rogers is speaking to whom? What perspective is Rogers' model considering? Do you think he's speaking to facilitators? Do you think he's speaking to marketers? Do you think he's speaking to participants? And again, people are voting. Up to about 40%, almost 50% have voted. %60 have voted. Always slows down somewhere in the 60s. I don't know whether this is a harder question. Couple more people vote, and then we can see what the results are this time, because they're actually kind of interesting as I see them come up here. All right, it tends to slow down around here, so Tyler, let's put up the results as they are. Wow, it's like a tie, right? It's neck and neck. 34% facilitators, 32% marketers, 34% participants. Well, for sure, Rogers' model is much more about the, I'm going to say, the psychology of the adopter. Okay? A lot of Rogers' work and a lot of the research that followed Rogers' work was done and is really huge in marketing. Although Rogers is not strictly speaking to marketers, I don't think. A lot of the early research that he did, and his early research goes back to like the 1940s, was done on adoption of things like new kinds of seed in agriculture. You know, they wanted to find out why farmers didn't adopt or did adopt new kinds of seed and other kinds of innovations like that. So it became kind of embedded in marketing, and it is very much a psychological look at people going through a process of change. So, you know, if you said marketers, that's a pretty good vote. If you said facilitators, well, yeah, definitely, because it's about people who are trying to lead a group through change. And if you said participants, I might agree too, because it's much more focused on the experience of the person who needs to adopt or take part in the change than say Kotter's model, which is much more top down. You know, with Kotter's model, I feel like that's how are we going to get those people to change? Whereas with Rogers, it's more like, what are people thinking? What are they going through as they work through a process of change, deciding to adopt a change? So I think that there's that difference there. So we can take that poll result back down and we can kind of click along a little bit more and see how we go. Now, here's a question for you, and there's no poll here, but a little reflection. How does this work for you? In your project, you know, which perspectives do you think you need to especially consider? Assuming you're not just the boss, right? You're not just going to bang your fist on the table and make people do what you want them to do. You've got to think about what they're going through and what they're thinking. So whose perspectives do you need to consider? Who are the stakeholders? Who are the different stakeholders? If, for example, we're talking about implementing, you know, quality sport in a community sport organization, well, there's the members, there's the coaches, but there might also be the municipality if you have to, for example, rent fields. There might be other people whose policy you have to consider, the provincial sport organization. You might need to think about a number of different perspectives. If it's a school-based activity, you might need to think about the principal, the teachers, the students, the Board of Education, and so on, right? So hopefully you've taken a second, you've thought about, kind of listed in your mind the different perspectives you need to consider. Because in practice, it's not so easy, and each different stakeholder group, each person with a different perspective is kind of walking this journey in parallel, but maybe at their own pace. Everybody's not going through it in lockstep. Different groups, different perspectives are going to proceed through it at different rates. And as we saw a couple of slides ago, people would go at different rates anyway. Some people are keen and they want to be early adopters. Others are going to be laggards. They're going to wait till the bitter end. Others are going to be somewhere in that big majority in the middle. So in practice, you've got a bunch of these processes going on in parallel at the same time. And each of them has its own, you know, process within a process, right? So the knowledge stage, I'm going to talk about the stages in more depth in a second, but in the knowledge stage, when people are becoming aware of this new thing, you know, what were the conditions that existed already? Is there some crisis? Is something happening that's making people say, hey, we've got to do something right now? Have people identified a set of needs? What are the networks? You know, who talks to whom? What's the culture within the group? Are people changing things all the time? Are they doing the same things they've done 100 years? You know, what's the stuff underlying when they encounter this for the first time? When we get to the persuasion stage, who's doing the persuading? Again, are people disposed to support or resist? Are there other things going on? Other big priorities that would derail, you know, this and lead to kind of a dormant period? Are there external pressures from outside organizations? When the time comes to make a decision, whether we adopt or don't adopt, again, what's going on under the surface? Internal conflicts, certain roadblocks, what are the risks entailed? Does fear of the risks lead to a very lengthy decision stage? When we finally get to implementation, everybody thinks, oh, you know, we're going to tell people about it, knowledge, and we'll go straight to implementation. No, we're not. But when we finally get there, do we have the resources? Do we have the knowledge? Again, have other priorities gotten in the way? And when we get to the confirmation stage, where we've actually done it, we've done the change, well, now we look back and go, did it work? So are we going to perpetuate even the mistakes we made in the process? Are we going to really take the time to analyze and understand, really do kind of the post-mortem to understand what happened within our organization? Or are we just going to go, yeah, okay, you know, moving on? All these things are under the surface. And it might take us more time than we think, right? We might get through the knowledge stage in days. Yeah, okay, everybody understands what it's about. We might take months in the persuasion stage. Decision might come quickly. Something else might take longer. So as we work in our organizations and as we work through our projects, we have to be prepared for these big lulls, gaps, delays, frustrating, sometimes understandable, sometimes not understandable at all, but still there they are, big delays. And it's really just part of the game. Have you ever had a project that really just kind of stalled? Totally stalled? Probably you have, or been involved in one. Take a second and think about why you think it totally stalled. I've talked to many groups about this, and the typical answers would be staff change, key person left, budget change, we ran out of money, other priority, had to fight another fire, crisis occurred. Those are probably the top 3 reasons why people say their projects really stalled. But again, perfectly normal, and probably something you should expect. So, little kind of mental task at this point as we go here. Think of a specific problem statement in your project. What are you trying to change? You probably had this in mind, back when you wrote your application. You probably identified what it was that you thought you needed to change, but just kind of hold that in your mind right now. We need to change the attitudes of our instructors. We need to change the participation levels of our a certain group. We need to change something, right? So as I said a second ago, now who are all the stakeholders? So you know what you want to change, but what do the stakeholders think about that? And again, list them for yourself. I've thrown down some here. You might have government funding agencies. You might have, all the different components within a community sport club, like the board, the coaches, the members. You might be in a more of a fitness or activity-based setting, municipal recreation department or something like that. Well, you might have, city council, your directors or managers, the workers, the members and participants, and so on, right? What do you think each of them thinks about this "we need to change" statement? Do they each have a different perspective? Do some agree and some disagree? Are some likely to move fast and others likely to move slow? Even within groups, even if we just look within, say, a group of instructors, who is likely to move faster and who is likely to move slower, and why might that be? It's really worthwhile, and as I said, when I do this as a longer workshop or a live workshop, we have a worksheet and we sort of fill this out and we strategize around it, but it's really worthwhile to kind of list for yourself who are the key stakeholders and what are their perspectives on this change process, because generally you need to find ways to integrate all of them for the change process to be successful. And by thinking about what's at stake for them, and by thinking about how either they might reframe the problem from their own perspective, or how you might reframe the problem to help address their perspective, again, that's a strategy step in leading your change process. I'll give you an example. Again, working with communities where we have multi-sector groups working together in a community. By multi-sector groups, I mean you might have representatives from boards of education, public health, municipal recreation, community sport, all at the table trying to create a more physically literate, fill in the community name, right? So I've done a lot of that work, and people from boards of education, whether they're principals, trustees, whomever, will often say, we have a challenge. Our teachers don't necessarily know how to lead physical movement activities in in a way that's consistent with developing the physical literacy of the kids. We think this is super important. We want to do it, but we know that our teachers who have to actually lead the activities, maybe they're generalist teachers, they're not necessarily physical education specialists. They either don't have the knowledge, they don't feel comfortable doing it. Okay, super important to know that, right? Super important not just to show up at the school board and say, look, here's our program, just adopt it and we'll go. Because they will look at you and say, well, first we kind of have to upskill, or we have to, at least bring into the conversation the teachers who have to actually lead these activities. How are we going to do that? Oh, yeah, I didn't think about that. So really important exercise to go through. Remembering as we go through it that, people don't necessarily want to take on a massive change project just for the sake of doing a project. They generally have a problem in mind. And if you haven't thought about how the different stakeholders have different views of what their problem is, it can be really quite challenging to bring them on side into the process. Right? People don't actually want to buy a drill to own a drill. They go out to buy a drill because they need a hole. So again, as you work through the perspectives, how could you position what you're trying to do as a solution to the problem that they've expressed that they've already have? The implication there being you need to listen to them and understand the problem they think that they have so that you can find a way to help address that problem, right? Certainly with long-term athlete development, sport organizations were going, wow, this is huge. Like there's so much stuff to do. We have to change everything. Like this could take us forever. So allowing that idea to rest is not nearly as productive as to say, well, what is the problem you're trying to solve? Well, we want more participants in whatever category. Okay, well, if we do it this way, we should be able to increase participation in that category. Let's try this. Now, change the slide, change the page. I want to just kind of ask a question here about whether we think that working with communities is different. I've been talking a lot about working with organizations. Organizations are relatively defined and compact. I mean, when you're in them, they can be sprawling and messy, but at least we can sort of say these are the boundaries. Communities is like collectives of organizations and people, all kinds of different stakeholders. And here we're going to look at a couple of papers by a writer named Harwood. Community and collective impact is what this is taken from. And you can see on the screen, again, 5 stages, which in Harwood are called community rhythms. So I'll just kind of go through them quickly because there's not a lot of words to explain what this means, right? The waiting place is the period in a community's life where there is some sense that something needs to change, but there's no catalyst, there's nothing to make it change. There's just kind of a ill-defined or not well-expressed need, or different people have different perspectives on what the need is. So that's the waiting place. Impasse is the period where some people come forward and say, okay, let's do it this way, and other people say, no, we can't do it that way, we need to do it a different way. So that's pretty familiar in community life. Someone comes to City Hall and says, I propose that we spend another $1 billion on public transit so that we don't have to have so many cars on the road, and somebody else says we haven't got $1 billion for public transit, and what are we going to do with all the parking lots we just built? And you have an impasse. The catalytic stage is a stage in which there's a coalescence around a certain idea or approach, and things start to move quickly. A growth phase, which is probably pretty self-explanatory. Actually, the change is underway, and then sustaining or renewing. Okay. And I ask you whether you see any resemblance between the 8 stages, Rogers' 5 steps, and these community rhythms. Because for me, certainly, between Rogers and this, I see a tremendous overlap. So I ask, if we look at all these systems, what does it mean if different perspectives, different writers, different people that have studied change in communities and organizations all kind of see the same thing? Are we getting closer to, yeah, okay, they're different perspectives, but this is how it happens. And again, what does that mean for us, right? Like, do we need to do something different because we're working with a whole community? For those of you that are doing collective impact type projects or community type projects, do we do something different, or is it basically the same with a couple of additional dimensions, which is kind of the way I view it, I think, a little bit like that. Now, here's some more stuff, and I know this might not be the easiest thing to read, but Harwood suggests that the more of these enabling factors that you can see in the box that exist in your community, the easier it is to support and facilitate change. So I'm not going to read all of that text because there's a lot of text there, but you can see that there's a bunch of them. An abundance of social gatherings, right? Do people get together a lot in the community to talk about things? Are there organized spaces for that? Are there places that make it easy for them to do that? Boundary spanning organizations, organizations that connect different other organizations or groups whose job it is to bring people together, or whose job it is to cross boundaries and work with different groups. Is it safe to make decisions? This is a really important one. You can think about this even in an organization, not just in the community, right? What happens to somebody who goes out on a limb and makes that decision? Is there strong and diverse leadership? Are there lots of networks and links? Is there conscious community discussion? Conscious community discussion, right? I mean, people thinking about the future and how to shape it and convening conversations about how to do that. What are the norms for public life? Do people who speak about something in public in whatever forum, are they listened to respectfully in the community, or are they, immediately attacked, for example? And is there a sense of shared purpose? Does the community, however we define community, have a sense of, this is who we are, this is what we're about, this is what we're trying to do? So Harwood's point is, the more of these you have, the easier it is, the more likely it will be that you will be able to build a coalition around change. And again, for us, the question is, okay, if we think we have some of these, what might we do? Could we do anything to put some others in place? Are there some of these which are easier for us to tap into or influence than others? How might we do that, right? It might be hard for us to change the community norms around speaking in public, but it might be easier for us to tap into existing networks. If we just think about finding the networks, figuring out who talks to whom and how we can tap into it. Or to identify boundary spanning organizations and call them up and say, hey, we haven't talked, but we're trying to lead a project around increasing physical activity in our community. And it seems to me that you guys, by the virtue of what you do, are in touch with a bunch of people that we want to be in touch with. So can we have a conversation about that? So an interesting perspective about communities, and probably a little more tilting around collective impact projects where you're bringing together a bunch of diverse stakeholders. Could we influence these or put more of these in place to help our projects? So with all that kind of loaded into our heads, I'm just going to kind of go quickly through the 5 stages and talk about what we could do as facilitators, as change leaders, to help groups work through the 5 stages. And again, with the preface of all the things that we've seen and talked about communities and different models and perspectives of change and different stakeholders and so on. So let's start with the knowledge stage, obviously. One thing about the knowledge stage is we kind of gloss over it. We often tend to say, okay, you know what? I know about something. Let's take physical literacy. That group of people over there doesn't know about physical literacy. So I'm going to walk over there and I'm going to tell them about physical literacy. Maybe I'm going to give them a book. Maybe I'm just going to give them a presentation. And then they'll know about it. And when they know about it, they'll love it. And when they love it, they'll all get up and do it. Sadly, I cannot hear you laughing, but I know you're laughing. But there's levels even within the knowledge stage, right? And it helps to think about that. So basic awareness. This thing exists. Yesterday, I did not know it existed. Now I know. But then I might go, okay, well, how does it work? So there's a deeper level of knowledge. Now I need to kind of dig a bit. Go, okay, how does it work? Smartphone, what's that? Oh, huh. Okay, well, how does it work? Oh, well, you have to have a contract with a, communications company, and oh, okay. Well, deeper level. Now that I know that, like, what could I do with it? Could I program my own apps? Could I get more apps? Could I, right? So even within the knowledge stage, there's sort of levels as people kind of work through. And you want to encourage and support them, obviously, to go deeper, because that's the level of engagement that's required for them to take the next step. So how can we do that? Well, the obvious ways, mass communication, we can put it on our website, we can send out flyers, right? But, seminars, workshops, all the things we're familiar with. One that we might not think about so much, but is very important, is the networking piece. And we'll see that as we go forward through the stages, why that's important. But often overlooked is to think about who's in touch with whom, who talks to whom, and how we could tap into several of those as we try to build knowledge about what it is we're trying to do. So there's the first step. It is never over at knowledge, right? The scenario I just described where they see it, they love it, they do it, I don't think that ever happens in real life. More likely they see it, they're intrigued by it, and if we don't do something, then they'll forget about it and just go back to doing what they used to do. So you got to get to the persuasion stage. And again, think about what they're asking. They want to know the obvious things, right? Is this good for me or bad for me? So, smartphone, is it a good thing? Would it work for us? Not does it work for somebody I saw on TV. Would it work for us? And critically, who else like us is using it? And I probably can't emphasize this one enough. This is an important principle in social psychology. People look to people like themselves to judge whether something is good or bad for them. So they will look at people that they judge to be most like themselves, right? If you show them an image, if you're talking to a rural community about doing something new and you show them an image of somebody, in a big urban community, they'll go, well, yeah, it works in Vancouver, but it's not going to work for us here, right? Who else like us is using it? And so they rely on some different sources of information than just you. The knowledge stage, they were willing to listen to you because you had knowledge and they didn't maybe. But when we get to the next stage, they want to start reaching out and tapping into others, right? They want to call a friend, people they think of as being like themselves, trusted networks, the people they talk to every day, and they will go around going, hey, long-term athlete development, what do you think? Like it? Hate it? Oh, yeah, our club, we implemented long-term athlete development 3 years ago. Unbelievable. Membership went through the roof. Kids are so happy, right? It's like, oh, really? Okay. Or, you've all done this, right? You've done this in your daily life every week, probably. Talk to a friend and said, what do you think about, does it work? You don't trust the advertiser. You don't call up the company that's advertising the product. You talk to a friend. So it really helps now to think of who besides yourself could be a reference, right? It's like, Sue, here's a list of people that, you might want to give a call to. Or even better, if you can get the references, to call Sue. Because just by suggesting to Sue that she call the references, she kind of looks at you and goes, well, you want me to call these people. Can I trust you? So much better if the reference calls Sue and says, Sue, I hear you're looking at physical literacy. Amazing. Got to do it, right? But first you've got to think about those people. Who are they? Who's like Sue? So there's another step in the strategizing here as we go. Finally, we get Sue to the point of making a decision. She understands physical literacy, she's explored physical literacy, she's talked to her peers in her networks, she's been persuaded, this looks good. I want to do a physical literacy project here in my community, in my school, in my whatever. Decision time. And now we get a different set of questions. It's like, okay. It's getting serious now. Is it going to be better to do this or to do something else, right? Because, this other organization has something that looks kind of similar. So should we do this or that? Is this sort of an easy fit for what we already do, or do we have to completely change everything? Is it easy to do, or is it extremely difficult to understand? Do we have to train everybody for, months even before we start? Could we try it? Can we try it in a small way? Can we do a pilot? Can we see it working? And how will we know if it's working? Like what will change specifically that we could measure, or that we would know that this is the way to go? These questions are likely to come up pre-decision. So obviously you need answers. And you need to realize that, again, the decision maker is going to be looking around beyond you. Yes, you can support. Yes, it's very helpful to have resources at this stage to try a pilot or to push, nudge it over the little decision-making hump. But they will also be calling other people. They will be, having board meetings without you. They will be making decisions. What's it going to cost? How are we going to manage it? All those things, right? So important to understand the decision stage, different again. Interesting study. This is a bit old, but kind of an oldie, but a classic. A researcher named Connie Gersick did a study on a whole bunch of groups that had to make a decision in a time-limited setting. Everything from school boards to hospital administrators, all kinds of different groups. And she found that they spent the first half of the time apparently doing almost nothing. All these projects, they sort of got off to a bit of a start, and then they kind of just went into a little bit of a dormant phase. It turned out that everybody was kind of sorting out the rules. Who decides what, who gets to say this, who's in charge of that. And once it was sorted out, around the halfway mark in terms of the time that they had, they took off again and made rapid progress. So again, really interesting, because when we think about the 5 stages, sometimes we're going to get to this point where it just seems to go into slow motion, maybe in the decision stage, and maybe that's because people are trying to figure out, sort of hierarchies and who gets to say, and I've got to go to the chair in order to get this decision, or whatever. Implementation stage. So good news, decided to do it. Bad news, we haven't done it yet. Now we've got to actually do it. And naturally, another set of questions, right? Now there's a whole planning phase around the actual doing of it, and that can take time. So again, we want to always be a step ahead if possible and think about, okay, as we get to this stage, knowing these are the likely questions, what are we going to do to make sure that this moves forward? Again, maybe they need a different kind of support. Additional support, external support, obviously financial support, human resources, and confidence. Just being able to overcome the inevitable challenges. One thing that happens a lot here is people say, well, can I change it a bit? like I like physical literacy. I like the program that you've shown me. But you know, here it's a little different. So could we do it this way? That's almost inevitable. And another roadblock is saying no, right? No, you can't change anything. Oh, okay, then we're out. So again, part of the implementation phase. So you have to think about ways to offer that timely support in order to sort of get people through this rather complicated implementation phase of actually trying it and doing it. And you have to wait till they're ready for that support, but you kind of need to have it available so that when they're ready and they come and say, hey, you know what, we're stuck at, you go, oh, okay, I got an answer. You know, I can bring in Joe who can help you with this. Fifth step, confirmation, people barely think about it all. It's like, well, why would we? All the hard work was getting them to make the decision to do it and then to implement it. Once it's implemented, it's good, right? We don't need to think about it too much. But obviously it's important because here's where people go, okay, so did that work or not? Do we walk away from it or do we do it again? Do we try to do it better? Or do we just, you know, say, yeah, just cut our losses? So a new set of questions, right? And now people want, obviously, evidence, measurement, yardsticks to show that, you know, things have changed and are better as a result, better than, you know, brand X, which didn't do it, better than brand Y that did it a different way. They want to get some validation of the fact that they changed it somewhat, right? Yeah, you know what? Not only do we validate that it was okay for you to change it, we want to celebrate it because you've done something brilliant here. And then they're in a position to recommend it to others. So a very, very important phase, not just for the people themselves going through this change, but also for you leading change elsewhere. Because now what's happening is these people are becoming the champions. These are the people that you use as references. These are the people that you are able to bring others to and have them show, this is how we did it. And I'll bet every single person on the webinar today has gone to a conference where they listened to people, organizations, whatever, explain how they did it, and you went, oh, wow, okay, that looks good. That looks like it works. Well, those people were, you know, at or through the confirmation stage. So you do need to kind of work through this to gather all that because it's persuasive for others. Again, they need a different kind of support. You can suggest different kinds of support to help. The most obvious one is the kind of one-year follow-up, whether it's internal or external conference opportunity. Maybe they can go and present externally about what they did and why it worked. Very valuable for everybody and good for themselves because they have to work through that process of you know, essentially understanding so they can communicate what they did. And again, I'm sure many of you have, you know, had that opportunity to present what you've done at a conference, and you know that in order to do your presentation well, you got to kind of go, oh, I've got to organize my thoughts around what we actually did. I've got to go back and look at what we actually did. Well, that's kind of a confirmation stage going on right there. Because that's, you know, they're the next wave of references. They're the champions that you draw on. They're the people that you want to be calling others going, yeah, it was great. It worked for us. It was a fantastic process. You should try it because it's really worth doing. But there's always some people that just like it all on one slide. So I offer this. If you're somewhat numb now from the last, you know, 4,000 slides and 3 different systems and umpteen perspectives and steps and stuff, you know, here it is on one slide. It's kind of cool, actually. You know, here we've got 5 factors for change: vision, skills, incentives, resources, and an action plan. And if you miss any one of them, you know, what's likely to result? I haven't got a learned reference for this because I think Andre Lachance sent it to me one day. But nonetheless, people like it because it reminds us that you do need all the pieces. You do need to go through all the steps. You do need to take the time. You do need to build the relationships. You do need to tap into the networks. You do need to try to understand the perspectives. And if you don't, if you miss one of those things, then obviously the project is not likely to succeed. So how do we make sure that we follow all the steps and do all the things that are necessary to have a successful project and implement what we want to implement? So I'm kind of at the end almost. I want to challenge you now to have a moment and think for yourself about 3 takeaways from this presentation. 3 things you remember, 3 things you might be able to use or do. The first thing that you might try as a result of this. So I'll give you a second. You can probably type some. I'd love to have some other, now that the polls are over, some form of interaction. So you could probably type into the question box, not necessarily questions, but something that's stuck in your mind. I'll take anything at this point. We talked about smartphones. There was a slide from the Obama election. Paul is very irritating. Really anything. Any sign of human life or contact. Great. Somebody typed something. People I know are typing things. This is so cool. I don't know if I can slide that over so that I can see all the things that people, because unfortunately I get the first 4 words, but I'm glad they're there. Yeah, Tyler?
Hi, Paul. So you should be able to undock the question pane from the control panel by clicking on it's like a square with an arrow coming out of the left corner, and then you should be able to expand it and you'll be able to see everything that way.
That's fantastic, because when you said undock the question pane, it sounded like some kind of moon mission thing that I was pretty sure I couldn't do. But then you said click on the little square, and now I can see them. Again, I guess I can keep making it bigger and bigger and try to pull things over so that I can read them a bit better. But reasons for project stalling, relationship between organization and communities, how they relate, taking into account key stakeholders needed when making change. Somebody loved the last slide because it made a lot of sense. I knew somebody would love the last slide. People always do. Great reminder that things do take time, and I need to give that to them. Yeah, for me, that's a huge element of this. Love to hear more personal examples. You have a facilitating change. Yes, come to one of the long workshops, and I'll just drone on forever about personal examples. Everything takes time, and people in contact. Absolutely good information. Wish I had this a while ago. Always good to hear. Thanks, Paul. Change is complicated. I like Roger's model. Good, good. Good to think about the persuasion stage, use of references or champions. Yep, great. Thank you for interacting. You can continue to do that. I'm going to give you, my takeaways here, because I'm always worried that nobody will play the little game and type in the box or interact at all. So I came up with 3. So these are the 3 for me anyway. What I think is, some of the big points here, right? The idea of change is a journey, that the challenges change along the way, the needs change along the way. You can't necessarily do it all yourself from the beginning and expect it to be linear, right? As it changes, you need to be responsive, and sometimes that responsiveness means drawing on others, tapping into networks, and so on, right? So that's number 1 for me. Number 2, just the need to listen, understand the perspectives. And once you feel that you're starting to understand them, then, to be able to find some solutions for each, right? So help each person, each perspective find what's in it for them and why they want to be involved in this. And then finally, and this has come up, and some of you have already raised this, it's just the fact that it's just inevitable. There will be delays, changes of direction. There will be long periods where nothing happens. There will be crises where somebody indispensable got a new job on the other side of the country and now there's a hiring process and you don't know what's going on. It's good to normalize that with the group almost from the get-go, because people get frustrated and they want to walk away. It's good if they know in advance. That's one reason I use that Gersick reference. It's good if they know in advance that it's normal for groups to hit these hiatus points. So these, like dormant periods where it looks like nothing's happening, but really something is happening. It just can't quite see it. So those are my 3 takeaways. If you wanted my thoughts on this, and that really kind of brings me to the end today. But again, we've all done it. We've all done it before. It's happened to us, and I hope that over the last hour and a bit that we spent together, you've been able to think of some new ways to help move your projects forward. Because again, we can do this.
So funny, like, what is Lynn answering?
So open up for questions at this point. If we want to do the hand raising thing or the typing in the box thing, Tyler, my miracle moderator, can help with this in case anybody has any questions, comments.
Hi, Paul. We had one question. If you can go back to I think it's the another view slide 31.
I think I can do that.
Great.
Yeah.
And yeah, if anybody has any questions that they would like to ask Paul directly on this webinar, what you can do is in the attendees tab on the control panel, if you open that up, there's a hand icon. And if you click on that hand icon, it'll show us that you've got your hand up, and then we can unmute your microphone if you have any questions or if you want to engage in a verbal discussion right now.
Should be a flee icon that people can click if they just want to, get the heck out of here. And I don't know what that would look like. Would you like to design a flee icon? Not FLEA, FLEE?
Yeah, I think that might be the leave webinar.
Yeah, leave sort of a runaway kind of thing that you could click. I don't know. But again, in case nobody does put their hand up, and if you are on your way to bigger and better things this afternoon, thanks for taking part. Thanks for being a part of it. Thanks for your work around the RBC Learn to Play project and the great work that you're doing in your communities. In, I think, 2 slides from here or something, there's my email address. I'm always happy if you want to send me an email. I'm going to move off this slide for whoever was looking at it. It's over now. That's over too. That's over. There we go. So certainly you can email me. I'll happy to respond to any questions that you've got. And I guess just to say, thanks again and best of luck. And if there's anything we can do to support you as project mentors, please ask. We'll do our best.
So Paul, we do have a couple questions that have come in. One question is, how do you light a fire under people to help change happen? How do you make people feel that urgency that so many of these are based on? That's from Jillian.
I guess I would, as the comments that I made earlier, is I would try to take the time to understand what their perspective is. Obviously, if they need a fire lit under them, it kind of suggests that they don't share your perspective about the importance of this, or they have some other obstacles or roadblocks or challenges that make them say, yeah, it's good, but we couldn't do it. So, again, one, what is their perspective? What is it that they see as being the challenge or the reason not to do it? Secondly, what are their needs? What is it they want to accomplish? What is it that they feel is a priority? And thirdly, then, can you see a way that accomplishing the goals of your project can be consistent with or support them to reach whatever their needs are? If their only need is to be able to leave at 4 p.m. and not do any more work than they did yesterday, maybe you can figure out some way that your project will take work off their desk. I don't know. But to me, it's about perspective, understanding, and then trying to address where they're coming from.
Great. And concerning slide 31, Lorena was wondering if there are instruments to evaluate and or control the different parts of the process.
Yeah, I mean, again, if I go back to 31, now that everybody's seen my email for a while, Um, so, you know, Rogers is at 5 stages in his process. Cotter has 8 steps. You know, Harwood has 5, you know, stages or points in community change. Well, you know, this one too has 5 components, right? We could probably argue about whether these components are more important than somebody else's stages or steps, but point is you got to have a bunch of things in place, in this case 5 of them. And so, you know, you certainly could assess for these, just as you could assess for anything else. You could also assess for the negative outcomes and the one positive outcome on the right. You know, confusion, how do you assess for confusion? Well, you do check-ins along the way and you try to determine whether the group is clear on priorities and vision. Anxiety, you know, slow change or frustration. I mean, all these things, if you take the time, you can assess throughout the process. There's something that I worked on the RBC project with Sport for Life called developmental evaluation, which is really fancy talk for paying attention to the process inside and trying to learn from it as you go, right? And so I think all these things can be assessed if you take the time to stop at checkpoints and ask the questions.
Great. And Tanya asks, are there any existing programs to increase physical literacy in rural communities or small populations?
Well, that's a good Drew Mitchell question. I would say that you know, Sport for Life is working with a lot of different communities at different scales on physical literacy development. I would say also that just, you know, from memory, knowing the roster of RBC Learn to Play grant recipients that are focused on physical literacy, they also span a lot of different communities, small, medium, and large, and different organizations within communities. So I think that the answer is yes, and I think that maybe we can do more to kind of try to share learnings from those different kinds of communities. Maybe we could do that in an upcoming RBC Learn to Play webinar, for example. But I mean, I think if people have specific questions, if, you know, people say, hey, you know what, could you tell me what's going on in small communities of this size or smaller, or in, you know, school boards or whatever, and you sent those questions into us, we would probably be able to connect you with those kinds of communities, because it certainly is a program which is happening across Canada in very diverse settings.
Great. And then we've got a question from Sai. So I understand that the Learn to Play program is coming to an end. Will RBC be replacing it with another funding program?
I wish I knew. I wish the answer was yes, and I could tell you all that right now. We continue to have conversations. We've had conversations with Public Health Agency of Canada. RBC and Public Health Association have co-funded this, so they've basically matched funds. We're continuing dialogue around funding from Public Health Agency of Canada, even if RBC doesn't continue. And of course, there's always the hope that others will, but you know, we're also focused on being able to support communities through other means with other kinds of grant programs as well. Trillium Foundation in Ontario, other foundations Canada-wide, to continue this work. Any more? That's it?
That's looking like it.
That was 4 more than I expected, so I'm pleased.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Paul. That was an excellent presentation. We appreciate you taking the time to share this with everybody. And thanks again to everybody who joined us for this webinar today. We'll be having the next one in the series is tentatively scheduled for late August. However, we will be sending out communications around that once we have a date and that kind of thing lined up. So on the last slide here, Paul, if you don't mind just going to the poster there.
Yes.
Thank you. So here you can see our last 2 are scheduled right now for August 22nd and September 19th. Those webinars are Learn to Play in Schools and Innovation Grants respectively. However, as I just mentioned, that August 22nd might be changing, so we'll be sure to let everybody on this webinar and everybody in the RBC Learn to Play Year 3 phase know about that date once we get it locked down. And as far as right now, that September 19th should be good to go. So more information to follow on that, and you'll see there at the bottom of the poster, if you want to check out any of this webinar once the recording and slide deck is up, any of the past webinars in the series, and when the future ones are coming, you can check out physicalliteracy.ca/education-training/webinars. I know that's a bit of a mouthful, but you can see it down there, and if you want to take a minute to jot that down, if you don't already have it, that's where you can get that information. All right, and we did have a question here, who is speaking at the next two webinars? Again, that will be determined once we get the date and everything lined up. So so for the innovation grants, it'll be a collection of grantees. We don't know exactly who yet. And then for Learn to Play in Schools, the same thing. That's going to be a group of grantees who will be speaking to that topic. So, and then once we know exactly who they are, we will let you know. Okay, so a question about the August date change. It'll likely be later than August 22nd, but again, as soon as we know, we'll let people know. Tanya's asking, who is Drew? Okay, Drew Mitchell is the Director of Physical Literacy for the Sport for Life Society. He's also one of the community mentors in the RBC Learn to Play project. He takes care of a lot of British Columbia grants, and I can pass on his email if you would like to contact him. It is drew@sportforlife.ca. Okay, great, and I think that is looking like the end of the questions. So once again, Paul, thank you very much, and thanks to everybody else. We hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.